The knife was already at her throat when Alira Voss opened her eyes. She did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only made things worse in the Nightfall Pack, and the man holding the blade was Garrick, the pack enforcer, a wolf-born brute who took pleasure in reminding her exactly what she was. Nothing. A girl with no wolf inside her. A girl the moon goddess herself had forgotten to bless. "Move again," Garrick whispered, "and I will finally do what should have been done the day you were born." Alira's hands were pinned against the cold stone floor of the pack kitchen. Steam still rose from the pot she had been stirring only moments ago, the smell of rosemary and roasted meat now mixing with fear. Around her, 3 other servants stood frozen, too afraid to help, too used to seeing this happen to the wolfless girl to do anything but look away. "I did nothing wrong," Alira said quietly, her voice steady even though her heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. "I only spilled the broth. It was an accident." "An accident," Garrick sneered, pressing the blade closer. A thin line of red appeared on her neck, and for a moment, everything in the kitchen went silent. Then something strange happened. The blood that touched the edge of the knife was not red, not entirely. As it caught the candlelight, it shimmered faintly, a color that should not have existed. A pale, glowing silver, threading through the crimson like moonlight woven into water. Garrick froze. His grip loosened. The other servants gasped, and one of them, a young boy named Colin, dropped the plate he was holding. It shattered against the stone floor, but no one moved to pick it up. "What?" Garrick breathed, staring at the thin cut on her neck. "Is that?" Alira touched her own skin, confused, frightened, and utterly unprepared for what she saw on her fingertips. Silver, faint but unmistakable. She had spent 17 years being told she was worthless, hollow, empty of the wolf spirit that gave every other pack member their strength, their speed, their place in the world. She had never once been told her blood was anything but ordinary. Word spread through Nightfall Pack faster than fire through dry grass. By the time the sun set that evening, half the pack had gathered outside the servant quarters, whispering, pointing, some crossing their arms in disgust, others staring with something closer to fear. Alira sat alone in the small room she shared with 2 other servants, her knees pulled to her chest, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. Silver blood. It sounded like something from an old story, the kind elders told children to frighten them into obedience, not something that could actually live inside a person's veins. She did not sleep that night. She could not. The next morning, she was summoned to the Great Hall. Nightfall Pack's Great Hall was a place Alira had entered perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, always to clean, never to be seen. The vaulted ceiling stretched high above her, carved with the symbols of wolves in mid-run, and along the walls hung banners bearing the crescent moon crest of the ruling family. At the far end, on a throne built from black stone and iron, sat Alpha King Kalen Thorn. Alira had seen him before, of course. Everyone in the pack had seen him. He was impossible to miss, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning struck. He ruled with a coldness that made even his own guards flinch when he raised his voice, and he had never once looked at Alira as anything more than furniture that happened to move. Today, his eyes were fixed directly on her. "Come closer," Kalen said, his voice low and commanding, the kind of voice that expected obedience without question. Alira walked forward, her bare feet cold against the stone floor, very aware of every eye in the hall watching her. Garrick stood near the throne, arms crossed, a bandage on his hand from where he had gripped the knife too tightly the day before. Beside him stood Doran, the pack's oldest historian, a thin man with silver hair and tired eyes, who clutched an ancient leather book against his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I am told," Kalen said, rising slowly from his throne, "that your blood is not red." Alira swallowed hard. "I don't know what happened, my lord. I only know what everyone saw. Show me." For a moment, Alira hesitated. Showing her wound again meant reliving the fear, the shame, the confusion of yesterday all over again in front of the entire pack. But refusing the Alpha King was not something anyone did, not if they wanted to keep breathing. She pulled back the collar of her dress just enough to reveal the thin cut Garrick had left on her neck. It had already begun to heal, the way wounds always did, faster than a normal human's but slower than a full wolf's. Along the edge of the cut, faint silver still lingered beneath the surface, catching the torchlight like a vein of starlight buried in skin. A murmur rippled through the hall. Kalen stepped down from his throne and walked toward her, and Alira had to fight every instinct in her body not to step back. Up close, he was even more intimidating. his presence heavy in a way she couldn't quite explain, like standing too near the edge of a cliff during a storm. He studied the mark on her neck for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he reached out and touched 2 fingers gently to the wound. Alira froze. No one touched her. Not gently, not ever. The servants avoided her out of habit, the pack members avoided her out of disgust, and even her own parents, before they died in a border skirmish 5 years ago, had barely looked at her, ashamed of the daughter who had no wolf. But Kalen's fingers lingered there only a second before he pulled back, his jaw tightening as though something had unsettled him. "Doran," he said without turning around, "tell me what you know." The old historian shuffled forward, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the ancient book he carried. "My lord, there are legends, old ones, older than Nightfall Pack itself, stories of beings born without a wolf spirit, yet carrying something far older in their blood. The stories call them silver-blooded. It is said they appear once in 1,000 years, and that their arrival always marks a turning point for the wolf kingdoms." "A turning point?" Kalen repeated flatly. "Meaning what, exactly?" Doran hesitated. "The legends are unclear, my lord. Some say the silver-blooded bring ruin. Others say they bring unity. No one has seen one in living memory, so no one truly knows which is true." Kalen turned back to Alira, his gray eyes narrowing as though he were trying to solve a puzzle hidden somewhere behind her face. "Ruin or unity," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and you don't know which you are." "I don't know anything," Alira said, and for the first time since entering the hall, her voice cracked just slightly. "I have spent my whole life being told I am nothing. Now suddenly I am something out of an old legend, and I still don't understand what that means." The hall went silent. No servant spoke to the Alpha King that way. No one questioned him, challenged him, or dared to sound anything but obedient in his presence. Alira braced herself for punishment, for the cold fury she had seen him unleash on others who displeased him. Instead, Kalen simply studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his stormy eyes that she couldn't name. "Take her to the East Wing," he finally said, addressing Garrick without looking away from Alira. "She will remain there under guard until I decide what to do with her." Garrick's face twisted with disapproval, but he did not argue. No one argued with Kalen Thorne. As 2 guards stepped forward to escort her, Alira caught sight of Doran watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not fear, not disgust, but something closer to pity, or perhaps recognition, as though he already suspected something about her that he was not yet ready to say aloud. The east wing of the pack house was nothing like the servant quarters Alira was used to. The halls here were wider, lined with tapestries depicting old battles and older victories, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and candle smoke instead of boiled cabbage and damp stone. She was led to a room far larger than anything she had ever slept in, with a real bed, a window overlooking the training grounds, and a door that locked from the outside. A prisoner's room dressed up as a guest's chamber. Alira sat on the edge of the bed once the guards left, staring down at her hands, at the faint traces of silver still visible beneath her skin if she looked closely enough. 17 years of being invisible, and now, in a single day, she had become the most talked-about person in the entire pack. She did not know if that made her safer or far more in danger than she had ever been before. Through the window, she could see the training grounds below, where young wolves sparred beneath the afternoon sun, their movements fast and fluid in ways her own body had never been able to match. She had watched children younger than her shift into their wolf forms with ease years ago, while she remained exactly as she was, human, ordinary, wolfless. Except she wasn't ordinary. Not anymore. A knock came at the door, softer than she expected. When it opened, it was not a guard but Kalen himself who stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. Alira stood quickly, unsure of the proper way to behave in front of the Alpha King, in what was technically her own borrowed bedroom. "My lord." "Sit," he said, though it sounded more like a request than a command, which surprised her almost as much as his presence did. "I want to understand what is happening, and I think, whether either of us likes it or not, we are going to need each other to figure it out." Alira studied him carefully, searching for the cruelty she had heard about for years, the coldness that made grown wolves lower their eyes in his presence. She still saw traces of it in the hard line of his jaw, the guarded distance in his gaze. But there was something else there too now, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even concern, buried beneath the ice. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked. "Yesterday, I was nothing to you. A servant you never noticed." Kalen was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on her, as though he were considering his answer carefully. Yesterday, he said finally, I didn't know what you were. Today, I am beginning to wonder if I have been wrong about a great many things. Outside the window, the sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the training grounds, and somewhere deep within Nightfall Pack, old legends that had slept for 1,000 years slowly began to stir awake. Illyra did not sleep well in her new room, even though the bed was softer than anything she had ever known. Every creak of the old pack house made her sit up, certain someone was coming to finish what Garrick had started in the kitchen. By the time morning light spilled through her window, she had convinced herself that the entire encounter with Kaelin the night before had been some kind of fever dream brought on by fear and exhaustion. Then the door opened, and Kaelin Thorne walked in again, and she realized it had all been very real. You look like you haven't slept, he said, studying her with that same unreadable expression from the night before. Forgive me, my lord, but sleeping has become difficult since half the pack decided I might be a monster from an old legend. Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Get dressed. There are things you need to see. He led her through corridors she had never walked before, past guards who straightened the moment they saw him, their eyes flicking toward Illyra with open curiosity. She kept her chin up despite the stares, refusing to shrink the way she had spent years shrinking in the presence of pack members who despised her. They arrived at a chamber deep beneath the main hall, a room Illyra had never known existed. Shelves lined every wall, packed with books far older than anything in the pack library upstairs, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed with age. Doran the historian was already there, hunched over a table covered in scrolls, his silver hair disheveled as though he had been awake all night. My lord, Doran said, straightening quickly. I have found something you should see. Kaelin gestured for Illyra to step closer, and together they leaned over the table, where an old scroll lay unrolled, its edges brittle and yellowed. The writing on it was in a language Illyra did not recognize, strange looping symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly under the candlelight. This is one of the oldest documents in our archive, Doran explained, his finger tracing carefully along the faded ink. It predates even the founding of Nightfall Pack. It speaks of a time before the wolf packs divided into separate kingdoms, when all wolves lived under a single moon-blessed line. And what does it say about the silver-blooded? Kaelin asked. Doran hesitated, glancing at Illyra before continuing. It says the silver-blooded were once guardians, not weaker than wolf-born, but different. Where wolves drew their strength from the moon and their pack bonds, the silver-blooded drew their strength from something older, something the scroll calls the first light. It says they could sense danger before it arrived, heal wounds no ordinary wolf could heal, and in times of great need, they could unite packs that had been enemies for generations. Illyra stared at the scroll, her heart pounding. That doesn't sound like a curse. It sounds like a gift. It was considered both, Doran said quietly. According to the old texts, the silver-blooded were eventually hunted. Some alphas feared their power to unite others against them. Some believed their gifts should belong only to the ruling bloodline. Over time, the silver-blooded vanished entirely, and the wolf kingdom splintered into the separate packs we know today. Kaelin's expression darkened as he listened, his jaw tightening in a way that made Illyra wonder what thoughts were moving behind his stormy eyes. Are you saying my ancestors had something to do with their disappearance? Doran did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. My lord, he finally said, choosing his words with obvious care. The founding families of many packs, including our own, rose to power around the same time the silver-blooded vanished from history. I cannot say for certain what happened. The records from that era are incomplete, deliberately so, I suspect, but the timing is difficult to ignore. Illyra watched Kaelin carefully, waiting for the flash of temper she had witnessed him unleash on servants for far smaller offenses. Instead, he simply stared at the scroll for a long moment, something heavy settling over his features. Leave us, he said quietly to Doran. The old historian bowed and shuffled out of the chamber, leaving Illyra alone with the Alpha King in the flickering candlelight of the ancient archive. You think your family had something to do with wiping out people like me, Illyra said, watching his face carefully. I think, Kaelin said slowly, that I have spent my entire life believing wolfless beings were simply weak, a mistake in the bloodline, something to be pitied or discarded. I never once considered that the story might have been written by the very people who benefited from everyone believing it. Illyra felt something shift inside her chest, a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. For 17 years, she had believed the same story everyone else believed, that she was broken, incomplete, less than everyone around her. Discovering that the story itself might have been a lie built to protect old secrets was both freeing and infuriating. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now that you know what I might be." Kalen turned to face her fully, his gray eyes searching hers in a way that made her feel oddly exposed, as though he were trying to see past her skin into whatever lay beneath. "Now," he said, "I protect you, whether you want my protection or not." "I never asked for it." "No," he agreed. "But if word of what you are spreads beyond Nightfall Pack, and it will, other alphas will want you for themselves. Some will want to use your gifts, others will want to destroy you before you become a threat to their power. Either way, you are no longer safe simply existing quietly among my servants." Elira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly very aware of how large and unfamiliar the world had become in the span of 2 days. "I don't even know what my gifts are yet. I don't know how to use whatever is inside me." "Then we will find out together," Kalen said, and something in his voice, some quiet certainty, made her almost believe he meant it. Over the following days, Elira's life inside Nightfall Pack transformed completely. She was moved permanently into the East Wing, given proper meals for the first time in years, and assigned a personal guard, a young wolf named Owen, who treated her with a strange mixture of caution and respect that she had never experienced from anyone in the pack before. Not everyone welcomed the change. Garrick made his displeasure known every chance he got, glaring at her from across the training grounds, muttering under his breath about servants who forgot their place. Other pack members whispered behind their hands whenever she passed, some clearly frightened of her, others openly resentful that a wolfless girl now walked freely through halls they themselves had to earn the right to enter. Elira tried to ignore it, but the weight of so many eyes constantly on her was exhausting in a way physical labor never had been. One afternoon, Kalen found her sitting alone near the edge of the training grounds, watching young wolves practice their shifts under the supervision of an instructor. She had come to enjoy watching them, envying the ease with which their bodies transformed, wondering what it might feel like to have that kind of power living inside her skin. "You watch them like you're studying for a test," Kalen said, settling onto the low stone wall beside her without invitation. "I suppose I am," Elira admitted. "Everyone keeps telling me I have some kind of ancient power buried inside me, but I don't feel any different than I did a week ago. I still can't shift. I still bleed when I'm cut, even if the blood looks strange." "Doran believes your gifts may need to be triggered," Kalen said. "Fear, danger, extreme emotion." The scrolls suggested the silver-blooded's abilities often surfaced first in moments of crisis, before the bearer even understood what was happening. "So I need to almost die again before I find out what I can actually do." "Not exactly what I was hoping for either," Kalen admitted, and for the first time since she had known him, Elira heard something almost like dry humor in his voice. She studied him for a moment, trying to reconcile the cold, feared Alpha King the entire pack whispered about with the man sitting beside her now. Quietly patient, clearly troubled by questions he could not yet answer. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "Protecting me, teaching me, sitting here talking to me like I'm not just some servant girl you used to ignore. What changed?" Kalen was quiet for a long moment, watching the young wolves finish their training and begin filing back toward the pack house. "I have spent my whole life being told that strength is the only thing that matters," he finally said. "That mercy is weakness, that compassion makes an alpha vulnerable to attack. I built my reputation on being someone no one would dare challenge, and it worked. Everyone fears me. No one questions me. But somewhere along the way, I stopped remembering why any of that mattered in the first place. And I remind you of that?" "You remind me," Kalen said slowly, "that I was so certain about what made someone worthless, and I was wrong. If I was wrong about that, I have to wonder what else I might have been wrong about." Elira did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, simply sitting beside him in comfortable silence as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains, painting the training grounds in shades of orange and gold. For the first time since the knife had touched her throat in the kitchen, she felt something close to safe, though she could not yet tell if that feeling was wisdom or simply a dangerous kind of hope. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the pack house, a spy sent by a rival alpha who had already heard whispers of a wolfless girl with silver blood, and who had already begun planning exactly how to make use of what she might become. The scream tore through the training grounds before anyone understood what was happening. Elira had been walking back from the kitchens, carrying a tray of bread for the guards stationed near the east wing, when the sound ripped through the afternoon calm. She dropped the tray without thinking and ran toward the noise, her heart hammering, some instinct pulling her forward faster than she thought her human legs could carry her. A young pup named Hazel, barely 12 years old, lay crumpled near the training fence, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath her. She had been practicing her first shift, still clumsy in her new wolf form, and had fallen wrong from the low training platform. Blood soaked through her fur, and her small body trembled, caught halfway between wolf and human, unable to complete either shift in her panic and pain. The training instructor knelt beside her, helpless, shouting for the pack healer, but the nearest healer was tending to a fever outbreak on the far side of the pack house, and everyone knew it would take too long for her to arrive. Alira did not remember deciding to run toward the girl. Her body simply moved, dropping to her knees beside Hazel's shaking form, her hands hovering uncertainly over the twisted leg. "It's all right," Alira said, though she had no idea if that was true. "I'm here. You're going to be all right." Hazel whimpered, her eyes wide with pain and fear, fixed on Alira as though she were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly turned unstable. Without fully understanding why, Alira placed her hands gently on the girl's injured leg. The silver came without warning. It spread from her palms like liquid moonlight, seeping into Hazel's skin, and the girl gasped as the twisted bone beneath her fur began to shift, straightening slowly, the torn muscle knitting itself back together in a way that should have taken weeks, not seconds. The training instructor stumbled back, staring in open shock. Other pack members who had gathered to watch the commotion fell silent, and Alira felt something warm and strange pulse through her own body, as though the silver light connected her directly to the pain Hazel had been feeling, drawing it out and dissolving it into nothing. When it was over, Hazel sat up slowly, testing her leg, her eyes wide with wonder rather than pain. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she said, her voice small and disbelieving. Alira sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted in a way she had never experienced before, as though she had run for hours instead of kneeling still for only a few minutes. Her hands trembled in her lap, still faintly glowing with traces of silver light that slowly faded as she watched. The crowd that had gathered stood in stunned silence. Word of what happened reached Kaelin before Alira had even made it back to the East Wing. By the time she arrived at her chamber, exhausted and shaking from whatever had just moved through her body, he was already waiting, his expression a mixture of concern and something that looked almost like awe. "You healed her," he said, not quite a question. "I don't know how," Alira admitted, sinking onto the edge of her bed. "I just saw her hurting, and something inside me responded before I understood what I was doing." "Doran was right," Kaelin murmured, more to himself than to her. "The scroll said the silver-blooded's power surfaces in moments of crisis, fear, danger, the need to protect someone else. It felt like it was draining something from me," Alira said, examining her still trembling hands, "like I gave part of myself to fix her." Kaelin's expression tightened with something that looked almost like worry, an emotion Alira had never expected to see directed at her from the feared Alpha King. "You need rest. Whatever that power is, it clearly cost you something to use it." Over the following days, Alira found herself thinking constantly about the moment her hands had glowed silver, replaying it over and over, trying to understand the strange new sensation that had moved through her. She practiced in small, careful ways, healing minor cuts on her own arm, testing the limits of whatever gift lived inside her blood. Each time, the silver light responded a little faster, drained her a little less, as though her body were slowly learning to control something it had always possessed, but never known how to use. Hazel, the young pup she had saved, began following Alira around the pack house, with the devoted attention of someone who believed she had witnessed a miracle. Her parents, initially wary of the wolfless girl who had somehow healed their daughter, gradually warmed toward Alira, offering small kindnesses that felt foreign and strange after years of being ignored or mocked by the same pack. Not everyone shared their gratitude. Garrick's hostility toward Alira only deepened as her reputation among the pack members shifted from pity to something closer to reverence. He cornered her one evening near the training grounds, his expression twisted with a resentment that had clearly been building for days. "You think healing one pup makes you special," he sneered. "You think the Alpha King's attention protects you forever. But legends fade, wolfless girl, and when his interest moves elsewhere, you will still be nothing but a servant who got lucky." Alira met his glare without flinching, something steadier inside her now than there had been even a week ago. "Maybe," she said quietly, "or maybe you're simply afraid of what happens to men like you once people stop believing your strength is the only kind that matters." Garrick's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Owen, her assigned guard, stepped between them, his expression carefully neutral, but his stance unmistakably protective. "The Alpha King has ordered no one is to trouble her," Owen said calmly. "I would hate to have to report otherwise." Garrick stalked away without another word, but the look he cast back over his shoulder promised the conflict was far from finished. That evening, Kalen summoned Doran and Alira to the archive chamber once more, this time with news that darkened his already serious expression. "My scouts have intercepted a message," Kalen said, spreading a piece of parchment across the table. "It came from within our own pack, meant for someone outside our borders." Alira leaned forward, reading the hurried handwriting. The message was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. Someone within Nightfall Pack had informed Alpha Draven of the Ashwood Pack about the silver-blooded girl living among Kalen's people. "Draven?" Alira repeated, the name unfamiliar to her. "Who is he?" "An Alpha who has spent years trying to expand his territory beyond Ashwood's borders," Kalen said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "He is ambitious, ruthless, and if the old legends are true about the silver-blooded's power to unite packs, he will see you as exactly the tool he needs to finally claim dominance over every territory in the region." "He wants to use me," Alira said, the weight of the words settling heavily in her chest. "He will try," Kalen corrected, his gray eyes hard with resolve. "But he will not succeed. I will make certain of that." Doran cleared his throat quietly, his expression troubled. "My lord, if Draven already knows about her, others will learn soon as well. Secrets rarely stay contained once they cross pack borders." Kalen's jaw tightened as he considered this, his gaze shifting to Alira with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "Then we prepare," he said. "Whatever is coming for her, Nightfall Pack will be ready to meet it." Alira looked between the two men, feeling the fragile safety she had begun to build over the past days shift beneath her once more, uncertain and dangerous. Only a week ago, she had been invisible, unwanted, discarded by everyone around her. Now she stood at the center of a conflict that stretched far beyond Nightfall Pack's borders, carrying a power she barely understood, hunted by forces she had never known existed. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly, the confession slipping out before she could stop it. Kalen's expression softened slightly, the coldness that had once defined him giving way to something gentler, though no less intense. "Good," he said. "Fear will keep you sharp, but you are not facing this alone, Alira. Whatever Draven sends against us, he will find that Nightfall Pack protects what belongs to it." The words settled strangely in Alira's chest, a warmth she was not entirely sure she was ready to trust, given how quickly her world had changed, and how much danger still waited just beyond the horizon. Outside the archive window, storm clouds began gathering over the distant mountains, and somewhere beyond Nightfall's borders, Alpha Draven began preparing his own plans for the silver-blooded girl he had never met but already intended to claim. Rain hammered against the windows of the archive chamber 3 nights later when Doran finally uncovered the second scroll. He had been searching for days, digging through crates of documents that had not been touched in decades, following a single reference in the first scroll that hinted at a companion text. When he finally found it, tucked inside a hollow compartment beneath a false shelf, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the fragile parchment into the flickering candle beside him. "My lord," he said, his voice barely above a whisper when Kalen and Alira arrived at his summons. "You need to see this." The second scroll was shorter than the first, written in the same looping ancient script, but this one included a crude drawing, faded with age, depicting a woman with flowing hair standing before a crowd of wolves, her hands raised, a soft glow emanating from her palms. "It describes the last known silver-blooded before you," Doran explained, his finger trembling slightly as he traced the illustration. "A woman named Sable, who lived nearly 1,000 years ago, during the era when the wolf kingdoms first began to fracture into separate packs. What happened to her?" Alira asked, unable to look away from the drawing, feeling an odd kinship with a woman who had lived and died 1,000 years before she was born. Doran's expression darkened. "The scroll says she used her gifts to end a war between 2 rival alphas, each of whom sought to control the same territory. She healed the wounded on both sides, refused to choose favorites, and eventually forced the 2 alphas to the negotiating table, simply by demonstrating that neither side could win, while she continued healing their soldiers faster than either army could inflict casualties." "That sounds like a good thing," Alira said slowly. "Why does your voice sound like there's more to the story?" Doran hesitated, glancing at Kalen before continuing. "Because once the war ended, both alphas turned against her together. They feared what she represented, a power neither of them could control, a woman capable of ending conflicts they had built their entire reputations around winning. The scroll says she was hunted down and killed within a year of bringing peace between the 2 territories." The chamber fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the windows. "They killed the person who saved them," Alira said quietly, something cold settling in her stomach. Fear does strange things to people who have built their power on conflict, Kalen said, his voice low and troubled. A person who can end wars without fighting them threatens everyone whose position depends on war continuing. Alira looked down at her own hands, remembering the warmth of silver light spreading from her palms as she healed Hazel's broken leg, remembering the exhaustion that followed, the strange sense of connection to another person's pain. If the same fate that had claimed Sable 1,000 years ago was waiting for her now, she was not sure the gift she carried was worth the danger it invited. "Is that what will happen to me?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. Kalen turned to face her fully, his gray eyes fierce with a certainty that startled her. "No," he said firmly, "I will not allow it." "You can't promise that," Alira said. "Not against every alpha who might see me as a threat, not against Draven, not against anyone else who decides my gifts are more dangerous than they're worth keeping alive. I can promise that as long as I draw breath, no one will touch you while you remain under my protection," Kalen said, his voice carrying the same unwavering authority she had heard him use to command his entire pack. Except now, it was directed entirely toward her safety rather than his own power. Doran watched the exchange with quiet interest, saying nothing, though Alira caught the faint knowing look that passed across his weathered features before he returned his attention to the ancient scroll. Over the following week, Kalen doubled the guards stationed around the East Wing and personally oversaw Alira's continued training, determined to help her understand and control whatever power lived inside her before Draven or anyone else arrived to test it against her will. Owen remained her constant companion, teaching her basic self-defense between her sessions with the Silver Light, insisting that even someone with healing gifts needed to know how to protect herself physically. "You won't always have time to heal your way out of danger," Owen told her one morning, demonstrating a simple block against an incoming strike. "Sometimes you need to simply survive long enough to use your gifts at all." Alira absorbed the lessons eagerly, grateful for the sense of purpose they gave her, a welcome distraction from the constant fear that Draven's forces might arrive at any moment. She practiced healing small wounds on volunteers among the pack, slowly extending her control, discovering that the Silver Light responded more easily when she focused her intention clearly, rather than simply reacting to crisis and panic. She also discovered something else entirely by accident, during a training session with Owen that ran later than usual. A stray dagger, tossed carelessly by another guard during weapons practice nearby, skittered across the ground and struck Alira's ankle before she could react. The cut was shallow, barely more than a scratch, but as her silver blood welled to the surface, something strange happened. The wound sealed itself instantly, without her conscious effort, the silver light flaring briefly on its own before fading away. "It's healing on its own," Owen said, staring at her ankle in amazement. "You didn't even try." Alira stared at the already fading scratch, understanding slowly dawning. "Maybe my body heals itself automatically now, even without me consciously calling on the power. Like it's simply part of how I exist." When she reported this discovery to Kalen that evening, his expression shifted into something calculating, though not unkindly so. If your own wounds heal without conscious effort, it suggests your control over the gift is growing stronger, even without deliberate practice. That is good. It means you may be able to defend yourself in ways beyond simply healing others. "You think I might be able to do more than heal," Alira said, understanding the direction of his thoughts. "The old scroll mentioned the silver-blooded sensing danger before it arrives," Kalen said. "If that gift exists within you as well, it could give us warning before Draven's forces ever reach our borders." That night, as Alira lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling, she found herself reaching inward, trying to sense whatever instinct the ancient texts described. At first nothing happened, only the familiar quiet of the pack house settling into sleep around her. But as she focused, breathing slowly, allowing her mind to drift beyond the immediate confines of her room, she felt something. A faint prickling awareness, distant but unmistakable, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, certain the sensation meant something important, though she could not yet interpret exactly what. The next morning, she found Kalen in the training yard, overseeing a sparring session between two young wolves, his expression sharp with the focused attention he always brought to matters of pack security. She approached him quickly, unable to shake the unease that had followed her since the previous night. "Something is coming," she said without preamble. "I don't know what, or how close, but I felt it last night. A kind of pressure, gathering somewhere beyond our borders." Kalen's expression turned serious immediately, all traces of casual observation vanishing from his features. "How certain are you?" "I don't know how to measure certainty for something I've never experienced before," Alira admitted, But it felt real. It felt important. Kaelin studied her for a long moment, then nodded sharply, already turning to address the guards nearby. Double the border patrols immediately. I want scouts sent to the eastern ridge before nightfall. As the guards scattered to carry out his orders, Kaelin turned back to Alira, something unreadable moving behind his gray eyes. Whatever gift lives inside you, he said quietly. It seems intent on keeping us both prepared for whatever comes next. Alira wrapped her arms around herself, the morning air suddenly feeling colder than it had only moments before. Somewhere beyond Nightfall's borders, forces were indeed gathering, though neither she nor Kaelin yet understood exactly how close the danger had already come, or how soon the fragile peace they had built together would be tested beyond anything either of them had prepared for. The scout returned just before midnight, his horse lathered with sweat, his own breathing ragged from running the final stretch on foot after his mount collapsed from exhaustion. "Riders," he gasped, kneeling before Kaelin in the great hall where the entire pack leadership had gathered following Alira's warning. A small group, moving fast along the eastern ridge. They carry no banners, but their formation is disciplined, military, not merchants or travelers. "How many?" Kaelin demanded. "6 that I could count, my lord." But they moved with purpose, and one rider stayed at the rear, clearly protected by the others. "I believe they carry someone of importance." Kaelin's expression hardened, his gaze shifting briefly to Alira, who stood near the back of the hall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Draven's men," he said, though it was not a question. 6 riders seemed small for an invasion force, Owen observed from where he stood near Alira, his hand resting protectively near the hilt of his sword. "Draven is not foolish enough to launch open war before understanding what he's facing," Kaelin said, pacing slowly before his gathered advisors. 6 riders suggest scouts, or perhaps an attempt at diplomacy before more direct action. Either way, we will not be caught unprepared. He turned to address the assembled guards and pack leaders directly, his voice carrying the same commanding authority Alira had first witnessed in this very hall weeks ago, though now it felt different, aimed at protecting rather than simply demonstrating power. "Increase patrols along every border. No one enters Nightfall territory without my direct knowledge, and prepare the East Wing for the possibility that our guest may need to be moved to somewhere more easily defended." As the hall began to empty, guards hurrying to carry out his orders, Alira approached Kaelin quietly, her earlier warning replaying in her mind. "I felt them coming before your scout even confirmed it," she said. "That means the sensing ability is real. I can trust it." "It also means Draven's forces are already closer than any of us realized," Kaelin replied, his jaw tight with barely controlled tension. "Whatever gift allows you to sense approaching danger, I need you to trust it completely from now on. Your instincts may be the only warning we receive before real trouble arrives." 3 days passed with tense anticipation, the 6 riders never crossing directly into Nightfall territory, seemingly content to remain at the border, watching, waiting. Kaelin's scouts reported the riders made no aggressive moves, simply observing the pack's patrol patterns, gathering information rather than launching any kind of attack. On the 4th day, a single rider approached the main gate alone, unarmed, carrying a sealed letter bearing Draven's personal crest. Kaelin received the letter in the Great Hall, his expression unreadable as he broke the wax seal and scanned the contents. Alira watched from nearby, unable to read his reaction, though the tightening of his jaw suggested nothing good. "Draven requests a meeting," Kaelin said finally, folding the letter carefully. "He proposes a neutral location along our shared border, claiming he wishes only to discuss matters of mutual interest between our territories." "You don't believe him?" Doran observed, watching the Alpha King's carefully controlled expression. "I believe Draven wants to see her for himself," Kaelin said, glancing briefly at Alira. "Rumors of a silver-blooded girl are one thing. Confirmation is quite another. If he can verify what she truly is, his plans will only accelerate. So we refuse the meeting," Owen said. "Refusing invites suspicion, and possibly more direct aggression," Kaelin said, shaking his head slowly. "Draven is patient. If we refuse outright, he will simply find other ways to confirm what he suspects, and we will lose the advantage of controlling the terms of our first encounter." "Then what do we do?" Alira asked, her stomach tightening with unease. Kaelin was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that all carried significant risk. "We attend the meeting," he finally said. "But on our own terms, with our own guards, and with careful limits on what Draven is permitted to see or learn. You want to bring me to meet him," Alira said, understanding the direction of his thoughts even before he confirmed it. "I want to control the narrative before Draven creates one of his own," Kaelin said, If he sees you as strong, protected, and firmly aligned with Nightfall Pack, he may reconsider whatever plans he has already begun forming. But if he sees you as vulnerable, isolated, easily separated from my protection, he will act accordingly. Illyra felt fear coil tightly in her stomach at the prospect of facing an alpha rumored to be as ruthless and ambitious as Draven, but she also understood the logic in Kaelin's reasoning. Hiding indefinitely was never truly an option, not once Draven already knew of her existence. "I'll go," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded despite the fear churning beneath the surface. The meeting was arranged for 3 days later, at a clearing along the border shared between Nightfall and Ashwood territories, a location chosen specifically for its openness, offering no easy opportunity for ambush from either side. Kaelin brought a dozen of his most trusted guards, along with Owen and Doran, while Illyra rode beside him, her silver blood thrumming with an unfamiliar awareness that had grown steadily sharper over the preceding days. Draven arrived precisely at the appointed hour, flanked by an equal number of his own guards, riding a massive black horse that seemed to match his imposing presence. He was younger than Illyra expected, perhaps only a few years older than Kaelin, with sharp features and calculating dark eyes that immediately found her among the Nightfall delegation. "Alpha Kaelin," Draven said, his voice smooth and controlled, betraying none of the ambition Kaelin had warned her to expect. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Your letter suggested matters of mutual interest," Kaelin replied evenly. "I'm curious what those might be." Draven's gaze shifted deliberately to Illyra, lingering there with obvious interest. "Rumors travel quickly between territories," he said. "Rumors of a wolfless girl whose blood shines silver instead of red. I confess, I found myself unable to resist the curiosity of confirming whether such tales held any truth." "And now that you've seen her?" Kaelin asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from his rigid posture. Draven studied Illyra for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, almost predatory in its careful calculation. "Now I find myself even more curious than before," he said finally. "Tell me, girl, do the old legends speak truly? Can you truly heal wounds no ordinary wolf could mend?" Illyra met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the fear coiling in her stomach show on her face. "I don't perform demonstrations for curious alphas," she said, her voice carrying more confidence than she actually felt. Something flickered across Draven's expression, amusement mixed with something colder beneath the surface. "A pity," he said. "I had hoped we might discuss the possibility of you visiting Ashwood territory, where your gifts could be properly studied and appreciated by those with the resources to help you understand your full potential." "She is not a resource to be studied," Kaelin said sharply, stepping slightly forward, his entire posture radiating protective authority. "She remains under Nightfall's protection, and she will decide for herself where she chooses to go, if anywhere." Draven's dark eyes shifted between Kaelin and Illyra, something calculating moving behind his controlled expression. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I meant no offense, only genuine curiosity about someone who may prove significant to the future of every territory in this region, not merely Nightfall's." The meeting continued for another tense hour, filled with careful diplomatic phrases that barely concealed the true intentions beneath them. By the time both parties finally departed in opposite directions, Illyra felt drained, as though the constant vigilance required to appear unafraid had cost her nearly as much energy as using her healing gifts. "He wasn't satisfied," she said quietly to Kaelin as they rode back toward Nightfall territory. "He'll try again, won't he? Some other way to get what he wants." "Undoubtedly," Kaelin replied, his expression grim. "Draven does not give up easily once he has decided something belongs to him. Today was simply his first attempt at claiming you through diplomacy. When that inevitably fails, he will turn to less civil methods." Illyra felt the weight of that certainty settle heavily across her shoulders, understanding that whatever fragile peace had existed before today's meeting had now shifted into something far more dangerous, a countdown toward confrontation that neither she nor Kaelin could avoid indefinitely. Behind them, watching the Nightfall delegation depart from a hidden vantage point along the ridge, Draven allowed himself a slow, calculating smile, already turning his thoughts toward the next phase of a plan that had been forming since the moment he first heard whispers of a silver-blooded girl living quietly among his rival's people. The attack came at dawn, exactly 9 days after the meeting at the border, when the pack house was still half asleep, and the morning mist had not yet burned away from the training grounds. Illyra woke to Owen pounding on her door, his voice tight with urgency she had never heard from him before. "Get up," he said, already pulling the door open without waiting for permission. "Draven's forces have breached the northern border. We need to move you now." He dressed quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled on the simple clothes Owen had provided for exactly this kind of emergency. Practical fabric that would not restrict her movement. Outside her window, she could already hear the distant sounds of conflict, shouts carried on the wind, the unmistakable clash of steel against steel echoing from somewhere beyond the packhouse walls. "How many?" she asked, following Owen quickly through the corridors toward wherever he intended to lead her. "More than we expected," Owen admitted grimly. Draven's diplomatic visit was clearly a scouting mission after all. He learned our patrol patterns and used that knowledge to time his assault perfectly. They found Kalen in the Great Hall, already dressed for battle, issuing rapid commands to a stream of guards and pack members hurrying to their assigned defensive positions. When he saw Elira, something flickered across his face, relief mixed with fierce determination. "Stay close to Owen," he said, gripping her shoulders briefly before releasing her. "He will keep you safe while I coordinate our defense." "Let me help," Elira said, the words surprising even herself with their firmness. "I can heal the wounded." "I felt this coming, Kalen. I can sense danger before it strikes. Those gifts are useless if I'm hiding somewhere while people fight and bleed for me." Kalen hesitated, clearly torn between his instinct to protect her and the practical reality of what she was offering. "It's dangerous," he finally said. "Everything about today is dangerous," Elira replied. "But I refuse to be someone people fight and die for while I do nothing but wait somewhere safe." Something shifted in Kalen's expression. Respect mixing with reluctant acceptance. "Stay near the healing tents then. Owen will guard you there. If the fighting gets too close, you retreat immediately. Promise me that much." "I promise," Elira said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't entirely certain she would keep them if the situation demanded otherwise. The battle that followed unfolded in chaotic waves across Nightfall's northern grounds. Draven's forces pressing hard against the pack's defensive lines, while Kalen directed his warriors with the same commanding authority Elira had witnessed in the Great Hall weeks earlier. She positioned herself near the healing tents that had been hastily assembled, and within minutes, wounded fighters began arriving, some carried by their comrades, others limping in on their own. Her silver light worked faster than she had ever managed before, adrenaline and urgency sharpening her focus in ways her calmer practice sessions never had. She healed torn muscles, closed deep gashes, mended broken bones, moving from one wounded fighter to the next with a steady determination that left her increasingly exhausted, but unwilling to stop, while so many still needed her help. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Owen warned at one point, watching her hands tremble as she finished healing a young guard's deep shoulder wound. "They need me," Elira said simply, already turning her attention to the next wounded fighter being carried toward the tents. The fighting raged for hours, the battle lines shifting back and forth across the northern grounds as Kalen's forces slowly gained the advantage through superior knowledge of their own territory. But just as the tide seemed to be turning firmly in Nightfall's favor, a new group of Draven's fighters broke through a weakened section of the defensive line, cutting directly toward the healing tents where Elira continued working. "Move!" Owen shouted, positioning himself between Elira and the approaching threat, his sword already drawn. Elira scrambled backward, her heart pounding, watching Owen engage the first of Draven's fighters with practiced efficiency. But there were 3 attackers, and even Owen's considerable skill could not hold against all of them simultaneously for long. One fighter broke past him, charging directly toward Elira with clear intent to capture rather than kill. Time seemed to slow as the fighter closed the distance, and Elira felt something surge inside her chest, instinct overriding conscious thought entirely. The silver light that normally flowed gently from her palms during careful healing sessions erupted instead in a sudden, brilliant flash, radiating outward from her body like a shockwave of pure moonlight. The approaching fighter stumbled, momentarily blinded and disoriented by the burst of silver energy, giving Owen just enough time to recover and drive the attacker back with a series of precise strikes. The other 2 fighters, witnessing the strange silver light, hesitated visibly, clearly unprepared for whatever power they had just witnessed. "Retreat," one of them shouted to the others, and all 3 of Draven's fighters fell back from the healing tents, clearly reassessing their approach against an unexpected variable they had not accounted for. Kalen arrived moments later, having heard reports of the silver flash from soldiers stationed nearby, his expression a mixture of fear and awe as he took in the scene, Owen breathing hard but uninjured, Elira pale and shaking but alive. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders and searching her face with obvious concern. "I'm fine," Elira managed, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "Something happened. The light. It just came out of me. All at once. I didn't mean for it to happen that way." Whatever it was, it saved your life, Kaelin said firmly, and possibly turned the tide of this entire battle. Draven's forces are retreating on every front. Indeed, as the morning progressed into afternoon, reports continued arriving of Draven's fighters withdrawing across the northern border, clearly having underestimated both the strength of Nightfall's defenses and the unexpected power of the silver-blooded girl they had come to capture. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the immediate threat had passed, though the cost of the battle was evident in the wounded fighters still filling the healing tents and the exhausted, battle-worn expressions of Kaelin's remaining guards. Illyra spent the following hours continuing to heal what wounded she could, her own energy nearly depleted by the time the last patient had been treated. When she finally allowed herself to rest, collapsing onto a cot within the healing tent, Kaelin found her there, his expression softening as he settled beside her. "You saved dozens of lives today," he said quietly. "I almost got captured," Illyra replied, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "If that light hadn't happened when it did, Draven's men would have taken me before Owen could stop them." "But it did happen," Kaelin said. "Your gifts protected you when you needed them most, exactly as the old scrolls suggested they might." Illyra closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment to simply feel the relief of having survived, of having helped so many others survive as well. "This is only the beginning, isn't it?" she said, not quite a question. "Draven won't stop after one failed attack." "No," Kaelin admitted, his voice grave. "He will regroup, reassess, and return with a stronger, more carefully planned assault. Today was merely his opening move." "Then we need to be ready for whatever comes next," Illyra said, opening her eyes to meet his steady gray gaze. "We will be," Kaelin promised, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand, a small gesture that carried far more weight than either of them fully acknowledged in that exhausted, quiet moment. Together. Outside the healing tent, beneath the afternoon sun, Nightfall Pack began the slow process of recovering from the day's battle, unaware that Draven, retreating with his defeated forces toward Ashwood territory, was already formulating a far more dangerous plan, one that would not rely on brute force alone, but on something far more insidious, a betrayal waiting to unfold from within Nightfall's own walls. Nearly 2 weeks passed following the battle at the northern border, and though Nightfall Pack remained on high alert, no further attacks came from Ashwood territory. The quiet, unsettled Illyra more than open conflict would have, a nagging sense that Draven was simply waiting, planning something far more calculated than a direct assault. Her instincts proved correct, though the danger that finally revealed itself came from a source none of them had anticipated. It began with small things, easily dismissed at first. Supplies meant for the Eastern Guard posts arrived late, or not at all. Patrol schedules that should have remained confidential somehow became known outside Nightfall's borders. A guard reported seeing unfamiliar tracks near a supposedly secure section of the perimeter, tracks that led toward the pack house rather than away from it. "Someone within our own walls is passing information to Draven," Kaelin said grimly, gathering his most trusted advisors in the archive chamber one evening, away from the general pack population who might overhear. "Garrick," Illyra said immediately, the name surfacing in her mind before she had fully considered the accusation. "He's hated me from the beginning. He would benefit from seeing me removed, one way or another." "Suspicion is not proof," Kaelin cautioned, though his expression suggested he had already considered the same possibility. "We need evidence before accusing anyone, particularly someone with Garrick's standing among the pack." Doran, who had been quietly reviewing old patrol records spread across the table, cleared his throat. "My lord, if I may. The timing of certain supply delays correlates precisely with Garrick's assigned watch rotations. It could be coincidence, but the pattern is difficult to ignore." Kaelin's jaw tightened, clearly troubled by the implications. "Watch him carefully," he instructed Owen, discreetly. "If he is indeed passing information to Draven, I want proof before I act, not merely suspicion." The proof came sooner than expected, and in a manner none of them anticipated. 3 nights later, Illyra woke suddenly from sleep, her silver-tinged senses flaring with an urgency she had learned to trust completely. Something was wrong, close by, immediate. She rose quickly, pulling a cloak around her shoulders, and slipped into the corridor outside her room, following the strange pull of instinct that guided her steps. She found Garrick near the Eastern Archive entrance, speaking in hushed tones with a stranger she did not recognize, someone dressed in the dark colors of Ashwood territory. Illyra froze in the shadows of the corridor, straining to catch fragments of their conversation. "Tomorrow night, when the watch rotation changes," Garrick was saying quietly, "the Eastern Gate will be unguarded for nearly an hour. Tell Alpha Draven his forces need only wait for my signal." And the girl? The stranger asked. Alpha Draven wants assurance she will be accessible during the breach. She sleeps in the East Wing, Garrick confirmed. I will make certain she remains there, undisturbed, until your forces arrive to collect her. Alira's blood ran cold, understanding immediately the full scope of Garrick's betrayal. She backed away carefully, her heart pounding, and hurried toward Kaelin's chambers as quickly as her trembling legs would carry her. Kaelin listened to her account with barely controlled fury, his gray eyes darkening with a coldness Alira had not witnessed since her earliest days serving in the pack kitchens. He will pay for this betrayal, Kaelin said, his voice low and dangerous. We should use this, Alira said quickly, before Kaelin's anger could push him toward immediate, potentially rash action. Garrick doesn't know I overheard him. If we let his plan proceed exactly as he expects, we can prepare a trap of our own, instead of simply confronting him now. Kaelin studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration mixing with his lingering anger. You want to use his own betrayal against him. Draven expects an unguarded gate and an unsuspecting target, Alira said. Instead, he'll find your strongest warriors waiting, and Garrick exposed for exactly what he is. The following night, as the watch rotation changed precisely when Garrick had promised, the eastern gate appeared unguarded exactly as arranged. But hidden within the shadows of the surrounding walls, Kaelin's most trusted warriors waited silently, along with Kaelin himself, determined to personally confront the betrayal that had nearly cost Alira her freedom, perhaps her life. Draven's infiltration force arrived just past midnight, moving quietly through what they believed was an unguarded entrance, only to find themselves surrounded within minutes by warriors who had anticipated their exact approach. The brief confrontation ended quickly, Draven's fighters overwhelmed and captured before they could raise any meaningful resistance. Garrick, waiting nervously near the archive entrance to confirm his part of the plan had succeeded, was seized by Owen and two other guards before he even understood the trap had been sprung. His face drained of color as he realized the extent of his exposure, understanding immediately that his betrayal had been discovered and turned against him. You would sell your own pack to Draven, Kaelin said, his voice carrying across the courtyard where Garrick knelt, surrounded by guards, the captured infiltrators secured nearby. For what? Resentment toward a girl who never wronged you beyond simply existing? She doesn't belong here, Garrick spat, though his defiance seemed hollow given his current circumstances. A wolfless creature, treated as though her blood makes her worth more than warriors who have served this pack their entire lives. Her blood makes her worth protecting, Kaelin replied coldly. Your betrayal makes you worth nothing at all. Garrick was taken into custody, his fate to be determined according to Nightfall Pack's laws regarding treason, while the captured Ashwood infiltrators provided valuable information about Draven's broader plans and remaining resources. Alira watched the proceedings from a distance, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and unease, grateful the immediate threat had been neutralized but painfully aware that Draven himself remained free, undoubtedly furious at this latest failure, and likely already planning further attempts. This won't stop him, she said quietly to Kaelin once the courtyard had cleared, and only the two of them remained standing beneath the star-filled sky. No, Kaelin agreed, but it buys us time, and it eliminates his source of information within our walls. Draven will need to find new methods, new allies, before he can attempt anything similar again. Alira wrapped her arms around herself against the cool night air, exhaustion from the tense day settling heavily over her. I keep thinking about what Doran told us, about Sable, the silver-blooded woman from 1,000 years ago. She ended a war, and they killed her for it anyway. That will not happen to you, Kaelin said firmly, moving closer, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. I promised you that once already, and I intend to keep that promise regardless of what Draven or anyone else attempts. You can't control everything, Alira said softly. No one can. No, Kaelin admitted, but I can control how hard I fight to keep you safe, and I promise you, Alira, that fight will not end until every threat against you has been resolved, one way or another. Something in his voice, steady and certain despite the danger still surrounding them, made Alira believe him completely, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with her silver-blooded gifts, and everything to do with the man standing beside her beneath the quiet night sky, a man who had once been nothing but a distant, feared ruler, and who had somehow become the person she trusted most, in a world that had grown far more dangerous, and far more hopeful than she ever could have imagined only weeks earlier. Draven's retaliation arrived exactly 1 month after Garrick's betrayal was uncovered, and this time, he came with the full weight of Ashwood's forces rather than a small band of scouts and infiltrators. The warning came at dusk, when a nightfall patrol stumbled upon evidence of a massive force gathering just beyond the eastern ridge, far larger than anything Draven had committed to his previous attempts. Kalen received the report with grim resolve, immediately summoning his advisors and beginning preparations for what everyone understood would be a far more serious confrontation than the skirmish weeks earlier. "He's committing everything," Owen said, studying the scout's report with a troubled expression. "This isn't a probe or a scouting mission. This is Draven's attempt to end this conflict decisively, one way or another. Then we meet him with everything we have as well," Kalen said, his voice carrying the same commanding authority Illyra had come to associate with his presence during moments of crisis. Illyra felt the familiar prickling awareness building steadily throughout the evening, her instincts confirming what the scouts had already reported, a gathering storm of danger approaching from beyond their borders. She spent the hours before the anticipated attack helping prepare the healing tents, gathering supplies, mentally steeling herself for what she suspected would be a far more brutal test of her gifts than anything she had faced before. "You should retreat to somewhere safer," Kalen told her as preparations continued into the night, his expression torn between strategic necessity and personal concern. "This battle will be larger, more dangerous than the last. And more wounded will need healing," Illyra replied firmly. "I'm not hiding while people fight for this pack. For me, I told you that once already." Kalen studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his gray eyes, respect mixed with obvious worry. "Stay close to Owen," he finally said, "and promise me, if the fighting turns against us, you retreat immediately. No hesitation." "I promise," Illyra said, though the words felt heavier this time, given the scale of what everyone anticipated. Draven's forces struck at first light, their numbers indeed far exceeding anything Nightfall had faced before, pressing hard against every section of the defensive perimeter simultaneously, clearly intent on overwhelming the pack's ability to respond effectively to multiple threats at once. Kalen moved between different sections of the battle, coordinating his warriors with practiced efficiency, but even his considerable skill and experience seemed strained against the sheer scale of Draven's assault. Illyra worked tirelessly within the healing tents, her silver light flowing steadily, as wounded fighters arrived in numbers far greater than the previous battle, her energy draining faster than she could easily replenish it. Owen remained close beside her, his sword rarely still as he fended off occasional threats that broke through toward the healing area, but even his vigilance seemed increasingly tested as the battle wore on. By midday, reports reached the healing tents that Draven himself had entered the fighting directly, cutting through Nightfall's defensive lines with brutal efficiency, clearly intent on reaching Kalen personally. Illyra felt her stomach twist with fear at the news, understanding the danger this represented, an alpha of Draven's reputation engaging Kalen in direct confrontation. She found Kalen nearly an hour later, having pushed through the chaos of the battlefield against Owen's protests, driven by an instinct she could not ignore. Kalen stood facing Draven directly, in a cleared section of the northern grounds, both alphas circling each other warily, clearly having exchanged blows already given the visible wounds each carried. "This ends today," Draven said, his voice carrying across the clearing with cold determination. "One way or another, Kalen, either you surrender the girl, or Nightfall Pack falls beneath Ashwood's banner." "Neither will happen," Kalen replied, his own voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in his stance. The two alphas clashed again, their fight brutal and fast, testing skills honed over years of leadership and combat experience. Illyra watched from the edge of the clearing, Owen finally catching up to her, both of them helpless to intervene directly in a confrontation between two powerful alphas, without risking making the situation worse. Kalen fought with everything he possessed, but Draven's forces had clearly worn down Nightfall's defenders throughout the long morning, and exhaustion began showing in Kalen's movements, his responses growing slightly slower, his defenses momentarily less precise. Draven pressed his advantage, driving Kalen backward, until a moment of miscalculation left Kalen vulnerable, Draven's attack finding its mark and leaving a deep wound across his side. Kalen staggered, and Illyra's heart seized with a fear more intense than anything she had experienced throughout the entire conflict. Without conscious thought, she rushed forward, ignoring Owen's shouted warning, positioning herself between Kalen and Draven's next advancing strike. "Move aside," Draven commanded, though something in his expression flickered with surprise at her sudden appearance. "No," Illyra said firmly, her voice steadier than she felt, standing protectively before Kalen's wounded form. Draven studied her for a long moment, something calculating shifting behind his dark eyes. "So, the silver-blooded finally shows herself directly," he said. Perhaps this simplifies matters considerably. He raised his weapon, clearly intent on either capturing or eliminating her directly now that the opportunity presented itself. But before he could complete the movement, something surged within Alira, more powerful than anything she had summoned before. The silver light erupted from her entire body, brilliant and overwhelming, radiating outward in a wave that struck Draven directly, knocking him backward off his feet entirely. The light did not stop there. It spread across the clearing, washing over wounded fighters from both sides, closing wounds, easing pain, an instinctive response to the overwhelming suffering surrounding her that her gifts had apparently been building toward without her full conscious awareness. Kaelin's wound closed before her eyes, the deep gash sealing seamlessly, leaving him gasping in shock at the sudden absence of pain. Draven scrambled backward, staring at Alira with something approaching genuine fear for the first time since their initial meeting weeks earlier. "What are you?" he breathed, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. "Someone who refuses to let anyone else decide what she's worth," Alira said, standing tall despite the trembling exhaustion coursing through her body from the massive expenditure of power. Across the battlefield, Draven's remaining fighters, witnessing the silver light and its effects on the wounded from both sides, began hesitating, uncertain how to proceed against something none of them had prepared to face. Kaelin, fully healed and newly invigorated, rose to his feet beside Alira, his gray eyes fierce with renewed determination. "Your assault ends now, Draven," Kaelin said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet clearing. "You have seen what she truly is. Continuing this conflict serves nothing but your own destruction." Draven's expression twisted with frustration and reluctant recognition of the shifted balance of power. But he was not foolish enough to continue pressing an attack that had clearly turned entirely against him. "This is not finished," he said, though the words carried far less conviction than his earlier declarations. "Perhaps not," Kaelin replied, "but today, you retreat." Draven signaled his remaining forces to withdraw, the Ashwood fighters pulling back across the battlefield in obvious disarray, clearly shaken by what they had witnessed. As the immediate threat receded, Alira felt her legs finally give way beneath her, the massive expenditure of silver energy leaving her utterly depleted. Kaelin caught her before she could fall, his arms strong and steady around her trembling form. "You saved my life," he said quietly, his voice thick with an emotion Alira had never heard from him before, and countless others besides. "I couldn't watch you fall," Alira admitted, her voice barely a whisper as exhaustion pulled heavily at her consciousness. "I couldn't lose you." Kaelin's expression shifted into something raw and unguarded, an intensity that went far beyond simple gratitude for her intervention. "Alira," he said softly, "I need you to understand something. What I feel for you goes far beyond simply protecting someone valuable to my pack." Before Alira could respond, exhaustion finally overwhelmed her completely, and she slipped into unconsciousness within the safety of Kaelin's arms, leaving her response to his unfinished confession suspended for whatever quiet moment might come once the immediate danger had fully passed. Alira woke slowly, sunlight streaming warm through the window of her chamber, her body aching with a deep exhaustion unlike anything she had experienced before. For a moment, she lay still, uncertain how much time had passed since the battlefield, since Kaelin's arms had caught her as darkness closed over her vision. "You're awake," a familiar voice said softly, and she turned to find Kaelin seated beside her bed, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering worry. "You've been unconscious for nearly 2 full days." 2 days, Alira repeated, struggling to sit up despite the weakness still lingering in her limbs. "What happened after?" "Draven, the battle." "Draven retreated fully back to Ashwood territory," Kaelin said, gently helping her adjust the pillows behind her back. "His forces suffered significant losses, both from the fighting itself and from witnessing what you did on that battlefield. Reports suggest morale among his warriors has collapsed considerably." "And the wounded from both sides?" Alira asked, remembering the wave of silver light that had spread across the clearing. "All healed," Kaelin confirmed, something like wonder still coloring his voice. "Every fighter touched by your light survived, regardless of which banner they fought under. Doran believes this may be exactly the kind of unifying power the ancient scrolls described, though none of us fully understood what that might look like until we witnessed it ourselves." Alira absorbed this information slowly, remembering fragments of the battle, the overwhelming surge of protective instinct when she saw Kaelin wounded, the light spreading beyond her control yet somehow exactly as it needed to. "I don't remember consciously deciding to heal Draven's fighters too," she admitted. "It simply happened." "Perhaps that's the truest expression of what you are," Kaelin said quietly. Not a weapon aimed only at enemies, but something that recognizes suffering, regardless of which side it belongs to. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Illyra slowly processing everything that had happened, everything that remained unresolved between them following his unfinished words on the battlefield. Finally, she found the courage to address it directly. "Before I lost consciousness," she said carefully, "you started to tell me something. About what you feel for me." Kalen's expression shifted, something vulnerable appearing beneath his usual composed demeanor. "I did," he confirmed, reaching for her hand gently. "Illyra, when I saw Draven's blade find its mark, and then saw you throw yourself between us without hesitation, something became completely clear to me. I have spent years building walls around myself, convincing everyone, including myself, that mercy and softness were weaknesses I could not afford as an Alpha King. You have systematically dismantled every one of those walls since the day your silver blood first appeared." "Kalen," Illyra began, uncertain what to say, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and lingering disbelief. "I care for you," Kalen continued, his voice steady despite the obvious vulnerability of the admission. "Not simply because of what you represent for Nightfall Pack's safety, or because of the ancient legends surrounding your gifts, but because of who you are. Your strength, your compassion, even in the face of everyone who told you that you were worthless for so many years. I find myself wanting a future that includes you, not simply as someone I protect, but as someone I stand beside as an equal." Tears welled unexpectedly in Illyra's eyes, the weight of years spent believing herself unworthy of anyone's genuine affection, finally beginning to crack beneath the sincerity of his words. "I never expected this," she admitted. "Not from you, not from anyone. I spent my entire life being told I was less than everyone around me. Learning to believe otherwise has been difficult enough. Learning that someone might actually care for me this way feels almost impossible to accept." "Then let me help you learn to accept it," Kalen said softly, his thumb gently tracing across her knuckles. "Slowly, if that's what you need. But I am not going anywhere, Illyra. Whatever comes next, whatever Draven attempts in the future, I intend to face it standing beside you, not simply as your protector, but as someone who has fallen for you completely." Illyra felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom within her chest, hope mixing with cautious happiness she had never allowed herself to fully feel before. "I think," she said slowly, "I might be falling for you too, though I confess, the idea still frightens me almost as much as it makes me happy." Kalen smiled, a genuine expression she had rarely witnessed from the once cold and feared Alpha King, and leaned forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, careful and respectful of her continued exhaustion. "Then we'll be frightened together," he said. "It seems a reasonable way to begin." Over the following weeks, as Illyra's strength gradually returned, and Nightfall Pack settled into a wary but hopeful peace, following Draven's retreat, her relationship with Kalen deepened steadily. He made time for her despite the demands of ruling his territory, walking with her through the training grounds, sharing meals together rather than simply issuing commands from his throne, treating her as a genuine partner in decisions that affected the Pack's future, rather than simply a valuable asset to be protected. The Pack itself began shifting its perception of her as well. Where once she had been shunned as wolfless and worthless, now Pack members approached her with genuine respect, some even gratitude for the healing she had provided during the battle, others simply curious about the ancient legends she seemed to embody. Hazel, the young pup she had first healed months earlier, had become something of a devoted shadow, following Illyra eagerly whenever her duties allowed. Garrick's trial, delayed by the urgent demands of Draven's assault, finally proceeded before the full Pack Council, his betrayal laid bare through the testimony of the captured Ashwood infiltrators and the evidence Doran had carefully compiled. He was formally exiled from Nightfall territory, stripped of his position and standing, a consequence that satisfied the Pack's demand for justice, while avoiding the harsher punishments some had called for in the immediate aftermath of his treason. "Do you feel any sympathy for him?" Kalen asked Illyra one evening, as they walked together along the edge of the training grounds where their journey together had first truly begun. "A little," Illyra admitted. "Not because his actions were justified, but because I understand what it feels like to believe the world has already decided your worth before you've had any real chance to prove otherwise. He simply chose a far more destructive path in response to that feeling than I did." Kalen studied her thoughtfully, clearly moved by the depth of compassion she continued to demonstrate, even toward those who had wronged her directly. "You continue to surprise me," he said. "Even now, after everything you've experienced." "Perhaps that's simply who I am," Illyra replied, smiling softly. Silver blood or not. As they continued walking beneath the darkening evening sky, Neither of them noticed the messenger arriving at the packhouse gates, carrying news that would soon demand their attention once more. Word of unrest spreading among the smaller territories bordering both Nightfall and Ashwood. Packs uncertain which side to align with following the dramatic events of recent months, and increasingly curious about the silver-blooded girl whose growing legend had already begun spreading far beyond the borders where her story first began. The messenger's news spread through Nightfall Pack within hours, carrying implications far larger than anyone had initially anticipated. Delegations from 3 smaller territories bordering both Nightfall and Ashwood had requested an urgent audience with Kaelin, uncertain how to proceed given the shifting balance of power following Draven's failed assault and the emergence of the silver-blooded girl whose legend now traveled faster than any messenger could contain it. They want to know where their loyalties should lie, Doran explained, reviewing the formal requests spread across the archive table. Draven's reputation has suffered significant damage. Smaller territories that once aligned with Ashwood out of fear now wonder if Nightfall represents a safer, stronger alliance. This is an opportunity, Kaelin said, studying the requests carefully. But also a delicate situation. How we respond will shape the future balance of power across this entire region. Elira, seated nearby, felt the weight of what was unfolding settle heavily across her shoulders. They want to see me, she said quietly, understanding intuitively what the smaller territories truly sought beyond simple political alliance. They've heard the stories. They want proof that the silver-blooded legends are real, and that I represent something worth aligning themselves toward. Would you be willing to meet with them? Kaelin asked gently, clearly unwilling to push her toward something she felt unprepared to face. Elira considered the question carefully, remembering Doran's account of Sable, the silver-blooded woman from 1,000 years earlier, who had used her gifts to unite warring territories, only to be destroyed by the very alphas she had helped bring peace between. The parallel to her own situation felt uncomfortably close, yet she also recognized an opportunity that Sable perhaps never had. A chance to shape her own legacy differently, supported by someone who genuinely cared for her well-being rather than simply her usefulness. I'll meet with them, she finally said, but not as a curiosity to be displayed, and not simply as Nightfall's silver-blooded asset. I want to speak with them directly, as myself, and let them decide their own path based on that honest understanding. The delegations arrived over the following week, representatives from the smaller territories of Willowmere, Ashcombe, and Fenridge, each cautiously curious about the shifting political landscape and the young woman at the center of recent events. Kaelin arranged formal meetings in the Great Hall, but insisted Elira be treated as an honored guest rather than simply a subject of curiosity, a distinction that visibly shaped how the visiting delegates approached their conversations with her. The Willowmere delegation, led by an elderly alpha named Simon who had ruled his small territory for decades, proved the most direct in his questioning. The stories claim you healed dozens during the battle, friend and enemy alike, he said, studying Elira with sharp, assessing eyes. Is this true? It is, Elira confirmed simply. Why would you extend such gifts to those actively trying to harm the people you care about? Simon asked, clearly genuinely curious rather than skeptical. Elira considered the question thoughtfully before answering. Because suffering doesn't stop being suffering simply because of which side someone fought for, she said. I've spent most of my life being told my worth depended entirely on which category others placed me in, wolfless, worthless, unwanted. I refuse to place that same judgment on anyone else's right to be healed, regardless of which banner they carry. Simon studied her for a long moment, something like genuine respect settling into his weathered features. A wise philosophy, he finally said. Willowmere would be honored to formally align with Nightfall Pack, if such an alliance remains open to us. Similar conversations unfolded with the Ashcombe and Fenridge delegations over the following days, each ultimately choosing to formally align with Nightfall Pack rather than continue their previous cautious neutrality or wavering loyalty toward Ashwood. Word of these new alliances reached Draven within days, and though no immediate retaliation followed, everyone understood the balance of power across the region had shifted decisively. You've done more than simply survive Draven's assault, Kaelin told Elira one evening, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the training grounds, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed so much of their shared journey together. You've fundamentally changed how territories across this region view strength and leadership. I didn't do it alone, Elira replied, leaning slightly against him, comfortable in a closeness that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. None of this would have happened if you hadn't chosen to protect me instead of simply dismissing me as another wolfless servant. I nearly made that mistake, Kaelin admitted quietly. The day your blood first showed silver, My initial instinct was still shaped by everything I had been taught to believe about strength and weakness. It took witnessing your resilience, your compassion, to truly understand how wrong those old beliefs had been. 3 months after Draven's defeat at the northern border, Nightfall Pack gathered for a formal ceremony unlike anything the territory had witnessed in generations. Representatives from Willowmere, Ashcombe, and Fenridge stood alongside Nightfall's own pack members, filling the Great Hall to witness Kalen formally declare Alira not merely as a protected guest within his territory, but as his chosen partner, someone who would stand beside him in leadership rather than simply beneath his protection. For too long, Kalen announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, our pack, and countless others like it, measured worth entirely by the presence of a wolf spirit, by strength defined solely through violence and dominance. Alira has taught us, through her actions and her unwavering compassion, that true strength encompasses far more than any single measure we once believed absolute. He turned to face Alira directly, his gray eyes warm with a devotion that had grown steadily since their earliest tense encounters months earlier. I stand before this pack and our newfound allies, to declare that Alira Voss, once dismissed as wolfless and worthless, will rule beside me, not as an omega, not simply as a valuable asset, but as my equal partner, the Silver Queen of Nightfall Pack, and protector of every territory, willing to embrace the unity she represents. The hall erupted in applause, pack members and visiting delegates alike celebrating a transition that would have seemed impossible mere months earlier. Alira felt tears of genuine joy welling in her eyes, remembering the frightened, invisible servant girl she had been, the years of believing herself worthless simply because she lacked something everyone else took for granted. Doran approached her quietly amid the celebration, his weathered face creased with a satisfied smile. The old scroll's prophecy has finally found its true fulfillment, he said. Sable brought peace, only to be destroyed for it. You have brought peace, and found love and acceptance instead. Perhaps the old legends simply needed the right circumstances and the right people to finally unfold as they were always meant to. Perhaps they did, Alira agreed, glancing toward Kalen, who caught her gaze from across the hall and smiled with a warmth that still occasionally surprised her, given how far he had traveled from the cold, feared Alpha King she had first encountered. As the celebration continued late into the evening, word already spreading across the region of Nightfall's growing alliance and the remarkable silver-blooded queen who now stood at its center, Alira allowed herself finally to simply enjoy the moment, free from the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of her recent life. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges. Draven remained a threat not yet fully resolved, and the broader implications of her existence would continue rippling across the wolf kingdoms for years to come. But for tonight, surrounded by people who had come to genuinely value her, standing beside a man who loved her not, despite her differences but because of the strength those differences represented, Alira Voss, once the wolfless girl nobody wanted, finally understood what it felt like to belong completely, not through the wolf spirit she had always lacked, but through the silver blood that had always made her exactly who she was meant to become.